others. In the winter of 1886, a man drove his wife into a blizzard and left her to die. He took her inheritance.
She was supposed to be dead. She had survived anyway. And now she had come back.
She had one key, one proof, and 40 minutes before it would be too late.
He was about to sign. He believed she was buried. He had not checked the door.
The wagon wheel broke at 10 minutes past 9 on the night of December the 4th, 1886. Clara Reed knew the exact time because she had been watching the small brass pocket watch her father had pressed into her palm on the last morning of his life, listening to it tick against the howling silence of the Wyoming plains, counting the seconds between one gust of wind and the next as though the rhythm of it might keep her sane. The temperature had been dropping for 3 hours. The sky, which had turned the color of an old bruise sometime around dusk, was now completely invisible behind a wall of driven snow that moved sideways rather than down, cutting across the canvas of the wagon cover like 1,000 small blades, finding every seam, every gap, every imperfection in the stitching. She felt the rear axle go before she heard it. There was a deep, grinding shudder that traveled up through the floorboards and into her spine, followed by a sound like a rifle shot, and then the entire back end of the heavy Conestoga dropped 6 inches into the frozen earth and listed hard to the right. Clara grabbed the sideboard to keep from being thrown. The iron lockbox slid across the wagon bed and struck the opposite wall with a hollow, resonant boom. From the front of the wagon, she heard Emmett shout something at his brother. Then she heard Doyle laugh. That laugh. Even now, with the wind screaming and the temperature plunging and the wagon tilted at a sickening angle, that laugh was the thing that turned Clara's blood cold in a way the Wyoming winter had not yet managed. It was not the laugh of a man surprised by disaster. It was the laugh of a man watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. She had heard that laugh once before, 3 weeks ago, in the barn. But she was getting ahead of herself. She always did that when she was frightened, her mind sprinting toward the worst possible conclusion while her body stayed perfectly still, perfectly composed, the way her father had taught her. Arthur Reed had raised his daughter in the philosophy that a woman who showed her fear gave it power over her. So Clara sat in the tilting wagon with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set, and her heart hammering against her ribs like something trying to escape, and she breathed, and she remembered how she had arrived here. Her father had died on a Tuesday in late July of 1885. It had not been a slow death, the kind that allows a family time to gather, to say the necessary things, to make a proper accounting of love and regret. Arthur Reed had walked out of the house after breakfast to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, and somewhere between the porch steps and the barn door his heart had simply stopped. One of the ranch hands found him face down in the red Wyoming dust with his hat still on his head and his coffee still warm in the mug he had set on the fence post. He was 61 years old. He had built Diamond Cross Ranch from a single quarter section of broken ground and a borrowed team of oxen. By the time he died, he owned 3,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land outside Cheyenne, a herd of nearly 800 cattle, and an iron lockbox containing $60,000 in gold certificates that he kept under his bed like a man who had survived enough bank failures to distrust institutions made of brick and glass. He left all of it to Clara. Not to a male cousin, not to a business partner, not to the church, to Clara, his only child. His 26-year-old daughter, who weighed 280 pounds and had never been courted by a single man in all her years, and whom the women of Cheyenne society discussed in whispered, pitying tones whenever they thought she was out of earshot. Clara had stood at her father's grave on a hill overlooking the ranch and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with geology. The world without Arthur Reed in it was a fundamentally different place. It was a place where she was suddenly and completely alone, and where every man within 3 counties now knew exactly how much she was worth. The vultures had begun circling within the month. They came in the form of lawyers representing distant relatives she had never met. They came in the form of neighboring ranchers who had previously shown no interest whatsoever in Diamond Cross and now appeared at her door with their hats in their hands and acquisitive gleams in their eyes. They came in the form of bank presidents and land speculators and a representative of the Denver and Pacific Railroad who arrived in a very fine coat and explained at considerable length why it would be in her best interest to sell the eastern grazing sections to the company for a price that Clara's father would have laughed at. She turned them all away. What she had not been prepared for was Emmett Vance. He appeared in September of 1885, approximately 6 weeks after her father's burial, at the counter of Hargrove's General Store in Cheyenne on a Wednesday afternoon when Clara was purchasing winter supplies. He was 32 years old and built like a man who had worked outdoors his entire life, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same Wyoming limestone that pushed up through the rangeland in great pale slabs. He had a smile that arrived slowly, as though it was a private thing he was sharing only with you, and eyes the color of strong coffee that held a quality of focused attention Clara had never in her life experienced from a man. He held the door for her. He helped load her wagon without being asked. He introduced himself with a handshake rather than the condescending half-bow that most men offered women they did not take seriously. "Emmett Vance," he said. "I believe my father knew yours. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Reed." Arthur Reed was a man this territory could ill afford to lose. Clara had looked at him with the careful, practiced wariness of a woman who had spent 26 years learning to read the precise nature of male attention. She was not naive about what she was, and she was not naive about what she had inherited. She had spent her entire life in a body the world found excessive, and she had learned early that when men paid attention to her, there was almost always an accounting behind it. But Emmett Vance was unlike any man she had encountered. He did not look at her with pity. He did not look at her with the elaborate performed courtesy that men sometimes offered heavy women when they wanted to demonstrate their own magnanimity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a person he finds genuinely interesting, and Clara, who had wanted to be found genuinely interesting by someone other than her father for as long as she could remember, felt something shift behind her sternum. She told herself to be careful. She was not careful enough. He courted her through the autumn of 1885 with a patience and a deliberateness that she found, in retrospect, should have alarmed her more than it did. He rode out to Diamond Cross twice a week. He sat with her on the porch and asked her questions about the ranch, about the cattle operation, about the grazing rotations and the water rights, and the terms of the leases on the northern sections, and he listened to her answers with an attention that felt like reverence. He brought her books from the Cheyenne lending library. He fixed a section of fence that her hands had been meaning to get to for weeks, without being asked, and without making a point of it. On a cold November evening with the first serious snow of the season falling softly outside, he told her he was falling in love with her. Clara had been sitting across from him at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and she had looked at him for a long time without speaking, measuring the distance between what she wanted to believe and what her cautious, practical mind was telling her. She was 26 years old. She had never been kissed. She had spent her entire life being told, in ways both explicit and achingly subtle, that she was too much of something to be loved, too large, too loud, too direct, too much space in a world that demanded women be small and quiet and easily managed. "You don't have to say things like that," she told him quietly. "I know I don't," he said. "That's why I'm saying it." They were married in January of 1886 in the small Presbyterian church on Cary Avenue in Cheyenne, with a handful of ranch hands in attendance and no family on either side. Clara wore a dress of deep blue wool that her mother had left behind, altered to fit, and she stood at the altar and made her promises with a full heart and a trembling hand and the absolute certainty that she had, finally, at 26 years old, been chosen. The certainty lasted approximately 11 days. It was not a sudden revelation. It arrived in layers, the way cold seeps through a wall, finding gaps she had not known existed. The first thing she noticed was that Emmett stopped asking her questions. The focused attention that had characterized every conversation during the courtship was simply gone, replaced by a quality of distracted impatience, as though she were speaking to him from a great distance, and he was straining to hear but could not quite make out the words, and had largely given up trying. He began spending his evenings in Cheyenne rather than at the ranch. He came home smelling of tobacco and saloon whiskey, and something else she could not name but that made her stomach tighten. He began making comments about the way she ate, small ones at first, delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Then larger ones, more direct, stripped of any pretense of humor. Then one evening in late February, 6 weeks into the marriage, Clara went to the barn to check on a horse that had been coughing, and she found Emmett sitting in the tack room with his brother Doyle, who had arrived from somewhere in Nebraska 2 weeks prior and installed himself in the bunkhouse without much explanation. They were talking in low voices over a bottle of rye whiskey, and they did not hear her approach, and she stopped in the shadows of the barn door and heard her husband say, in the calm, matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing a business transaction, "The certificates are the key. The land deeds are complicated, but the gold certificates transfer clean once she signs. 3 months, maybe 4. We just need her compliant until the paperwork is in order." And Doyle had said, "And then?" And Emmett had smiled in the amber lamplight of the tack room, and Clara had felt the ground open beneath her feet for the second time in 7 months. "Wyoming winters are long," her husband had said, "and the territory is vast." She had walked back to the house in the February dark with her hands perfectly steady and her face perfectly composed and the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears like a river in flood. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her father's pocket watch against her sternum and breathed until the roaring quieted to something manageable. She did not confront him. She understood with a cold and absolute clarity that confronting Emmett Vance before she knew the full shape of his plan would accomplish nothing except to accelerate a timeline she did not yet understand. So she watched, and she waited, and she learned, In the weeks that followed, Clara conducted her own quiet investigation with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent her entire life learning to observe the world from a position of careful stillness. She went through Emmett's papers when he was in town. She read his correspondence. She pieced together, letter by letter and document by document, the full architecture of what he had built. Emmett Vance had known about Diamond Cross Ranch long before he walked through the door of Hargrove's General Store. His father, a man named Clarence Vance, had been a minor business associate of Arthur Reed's in the late 1870s, a relationship Arthur had ended when he discovered Clarence attempting to falsify a livestock inventory for insurance purposes. Arthur Reed had never spoken of it to Clara. He was not a man who carried grudges into conversation. But Emmett had carried something else forward. He had carried the knowledge of what Arthur Reed owned and the patient, calculating certainty that one day the old man would die and leave it to someone who could be made to give it up. He had written to a man named Prescott, a lawyer in Denver with connections to the Denver and Pacific Railroad 9 months before Arthur Reed's death. The letter was careful and circumspect, the language of a man who understood that written words could be produced as evidence. But the meaning was clear enough. He was positioning himself. He was making promises about land he did not yet own and certificates he had not yet accessed, and he was doing it with the confidence of a man who had already decided that the obstacle between him and what he wanted was not a human being but a problem requiring a solution. Clara read that letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back exactly as she had found it and went downstairs and made supper and set 2 plates on the table and ate across from her husband in perfect silence while the late winter wind rattled the windows of her father's house. She did not show her fear. She gave it no power. But she also began, quietly and without anyone's knowledge, to plan. The problem was the isolation. Diamond Cross Ranch sat 8 miles outside Cheyenne, far enough that a woman without a horse could not reach town in a day's walk, and Emmett had developed a habit of keeping the horses in the paddock nearest the bunkhouse, where Doyle could observe who came and went. Clara had no allies she trusted completely. The ranch hands were decent men, but they answered to Emmett now, and she could not be certain that a confidence shared with any of them would stay kept. She wrote a letter to Sheriff Walt Greer in Cheyenne, a man who had known her father and attended his funeral, and said the kind of honest, unceremonious things about Arthur Reed that told Clara he was a man of genuine rather than performed integrity. She wrote it in 3 drafts, choosing each word with surgical precision, saying enough to convey the reality of her situation without accusations she could not yet prove. She sealed it and addressed it and gave it to the youngest of the ranch hands, a 16-year-old boy named Perry, who she trusted simply because Doyle Vance had shown no interest in him whatsoever, which suggested Perry was of no use to anyone's scheme. She never knew whether the letter arrived. She never heard back from Sheriff Greer, whether Perry had delivered it and Greer had ignored it, or whether Emmett had intercepted it somewhere along the road. She could not determine. What she knew was that she was still alone in November when Emmett announced, with the smooth, practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed the conversation, that he had acquired an interest in a new land claim near the Wind River Range and they would be relocating before the deep winter set in. "It's a fine piece of ground," he told her over supper. "Higher elevation than Diamond Cross, but good summer grazing. We'll take the Conestoga. Pack what you need." Clara had looked at her husband across the table and understood that the timeline she had been waiting to decipher had finally revealed itself. They were leaving Cheyenne. They were leaving the town where she was known, where she had neighbors, where there was a sheriff who at least theoretically might be persuaded to act on her behalf. They were going into the open country in the approach of winter, with Doyle Vance riding alongside. She looked down at her plate. She looked up at her husband. "All right," she said. What else could she say? She had no proof that would hold in front of a judge. She had only the letter she had read in his study and the overheard conversation in the barn, and the slow, grinding accumulation of 100 small cruelties that told her exactly what kind of man she had married. None of that was the kind of evidence that stopped anything before it started. None of that put a man in handcuffs. So she packed. She packed her warmest quilts and her heaviest wool dresses and her mother's Bible and her father's pocket watch and every practical item she could think of that might extend a human life in a high plains winter. She took the folded letter from Emmett's study and sewed it into the lining of her heaviest coat with small, tight stitches that would not give way without deliberate effort. And she packed these things with the careful, specific intentionality of a woman who suspected she was packing for her own survival rather than a household relocation. They left Diamond Cross on the 1st of December, 1886. The sky was the color of old pewter and the wind had teeth in it already. On the afternoon of the second day, somewhere in the open country between the Laramie Mountains and the Wind River foothills, Emmett called a rest stop beside a frozen creek. The horses needed water from the hole they broke in the creek ice, and the men climbed down to stretch their legs. Clara remained in the wagon, ostensibly wrapping a loose quilt back around the iron lockbox to keep it from sliding. From beneath the canvas cover, she watched through a gap in the stitching as Emmett walked to the rear of the wagon and stopped, and Doyle came around from the other side, and the 2 men crouched down together near the rear wheel. She could not hear what they said, The wind took their voices. But she watched Doyle reach into his coat and produce something small and dark, and she watched him work at something near the underside of the axle housing for approximately 40 seconds. And she watched Emmett stand up and look out at the horizon and then back at the wagon with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a satisfactory outcome. Clara pulled back from the gap in the canvas and sat very still in the wagon bed with her hands folded in her lap and her father's watch ticking against her palm. She knew with a cold, comprehensive certainty that settled into her bones alongside the December temperature. The axle had been compromised. The only question now was where and when, and she understood that Emmett Vance had chosen his location carefully, because a man who had been planning this for months did not leave the final details to chance. She thought about running. She thought about it with the vivid, desperate clarity of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of the danger they are in. She could jump from the moving wagon. She could scream. She could produce the folded letter from Emmett's study and confront him with it right here, right now, in the empty country with no witnesses for 40 miles in any direction. She did none of these things, because she was a practical woman and she understood that a woman jumping from a moving wagon in early December in the Wyoming high country with no horse and shelter and no supplies was simply choosing a different form of the same death Emmett had already chosen for her. Confronting him here alone with Doyle a half step away and no one within shouting distance was not a plan. It was a gesture, and gestures did not save lives. She needed to survive the next 48 hours. If she survived, she could fight. If she did not survive, nothing else mattered. So she sat and she breathed, and she watched the sky. The sky, by 4 in the afternoon of December the 4th, had become something Clara Reed had never seen in 26 years of Wyoming winters. It had taken on a quality of depth, a pressing, suffocating heaviness that felt less like weather and more like the atmosphere of the entire continent had chosen this particular valley to express its full displeasure. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the span of an hour. She could see it in the horses, the way their ears went flat and their muscles began to bunch under their winter coats, the fine animal intelligence that detected a catastrophic incoming system approximately 30 minutes before any human sensory apparatus registered it. The wind shifted at approximately 5 o'clock. It went from a sustained westerly push to something circular and violent, gusting from 4 directions in rapid, disorienting succession. The temperature plummeted again. The mud on the wagon wheels froze solid in the span of minutes. Clara could feel the cold finding its way through every layer she was wearing, through the heavy wool of her dress, through the quilt she had wrapped around her shoulders, probing with the patient, systematic efficiency of something that had all the time in the world. The snow came at 6 o'clock, and it did not come gently. It came sideways, driven by a wind that had abandoned any pretense of merely moving air, and had become instead a force with intention, a force that pushed against the wagon canvas with the physical weight of something substantial and made the entire structure shudder and creak. The horses screamed. The temperature dropped again, and Clara could see her breath plumbing in the interior of the wagon like smoke, freezing as it rose, the tiny crystals catching the last gray light that filtered through the thrashing canvas. And then the rear axle went, the grinding shudder, the sound like a rifle shot. The back end dropping, the wagon listing, the iron lockbox sliding across the floor and hitting the wall with a boom that Clara felt through her boots. Clara grabbed the sideboard. She did not scream. She heard Emmett shouting. She heard Doyle's laugh. The one she had heard before, in the barn on the night she understood what her husband truly was. The canvas flap tore back and Emmett's face appeared in the gap, framed by frost and flying snow, his scarf pulled up to his eyes so that only the upper half of his face was visible. Those coffee-colored eyes that she had once believed held genuine attention for her. They held something very different now, and she was no longer capable of misreading it. "Axle's gone," he shouted over the roar of the storm. "Horses can't pull this weight. We have to ride for the nearest outpost and bring back a fresh team." Clara looked at him steadily. She said nothing. "You'll be all right in the wagon," Emmett said. "You've got quilts. Stay inside and keep out of the wind. We'll be back by morning." Doyle appeared behind him, pulling on his heavy riding gloves. He looked at Clara in the wagon with an expression she had seen on men's faces her entire life, the particular configuration of contempt and amusement that her size seemed to produce in certain men of limited imagination and even more limited decency. "You've got enough natural insulation to make it through one night," he said. "Should be grateful for it." Emmett did not look at her when he reached past her and picked up the iron lockbox. She watched him strap it to his saddle. She watched him mount his horse. She watched him and his brother become shapes in the driving snow and then become nothing at all, swallowed completely by the white roaring dark of the blizzard. The sound of the horse's hooves lasted for approximately 30 seconds before the storm devoured that too. Then there was nothing but the wind. Clara sat in the tilting wagon in the absolute dark, with the temperature outside now dropping toward 30 below zero, and she did not move for a full 60 seconds. She used that time to take stock of what she had and what she did not have and what she was going to do about both. She had quilts. She had several of them, heavy wool, the kind her mother had made by hand in the long winter evenings of Clara's childhood. She had rugs rolled up against the forward wall. She had an extra coat stuffed behind the seatboards. She had her father's pocket watch and the letters sewn into her coat lining, and the specific unyielding iron in her character that Arthur Reed had spent 26 years deliberately cultivating in his daughter, because he had understood something about this territory that most men of his generation preferred not to name aloud. That survival out here was not a matter of size or strength alone, but of will, and that will was something a woman could possess in quantities that would astonish the men who underestimated her. She did not have a fire. She did not have food or water in any form she could access without leaving the wagon. She did not have a way to signal anyone, because there was no one within range of any signal she could make, and the storm would have swallowed sound and light with equal indifference in any case. She began to build her nest. She pulled every quilt off the walls and floor and piled them around herself with systematic thoroughness, understanding in a practical way that her body heat was her only asset and that conserving it was her only occupation for the foreseeable future. She pulled the rugs over her legs. She put on the extra coat on top of the one she was already wearing. She tucked her hands under her arms. She pulled a quilt over her head and breathed into the enclosed space, heating the air around her face with every exhale. The cold was not what she had expected. She had expected pain, and there was pain, a deep biting ache in her fingers and toes that pulsed with her heartbeat. But what she had not anticipated was that the cold was also a presence, something with weight and intention, something that pressed against her from every direction simultaneously and searched for weaknesses with the patient efficiency of a skilled interrogator who understood that time was always on his side. She talked to herself. She talked to her father. She said his name aloud in the darkness under her quilt, not as a prayer exactly, more as a confirmation that he had existed and that she had been his daughter, and that those two facts carried a meaning that Emmett Vance and his brother in the Wyoming winter, and even death itself, could not entirely dissolve. The hours moved in a way that had no relationship to the ticking of the watch she pressed against her sternum. Sometimes a minute felt like 20. Sometimes what she was certain had been an hour turned out to be 10 minutes when she checked the watch face by the thin, guttering light of the small candle she had found wedged behind the seatboards. She lit that candle and held it inside the quilts and rationed it with the ferocious discipline of a woman who understood it was the only light she had. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, the pain in her extremities began to fade. She knew what that meant. She had grown up in Wyoming. She had heard her father talk about frostbite and hypothermia and the particular cruel mercy of a cold so deep it stopped hurting. The fading of pain was not a good sign. It was the body beginning to surrender in ways the mind had not yet authorized. She bit the inside of her cheek. The copper taste of blood was immediate and sharp and real, and she used it the way a man uses a slap across the face, as a return to physical reality, an insistence on presence. She bit it again. She forced her eyes open. She talked to herself in a voice she could barely hear over the wind, a low, continuous murmur, not quite words, more like a frequency she was broadcasting on, a signal saying, "I am here, I am still here, I am still here." She thought about Emmett Vance sitting in a warm saloon somewhere, drinking whiskey bought with her father's gold certificates, laughing with his brother about the fat, foolish woman who had bought them a fortune and then been disposed of in the most cost-effective manner available. She thought about that with a specificity and a vividness that was almost physical, and she let it make her angry, because anger generated a heat that grief never could. She thought about her father's ranch, about the Diamond Cross brand that Arthur Reed had designed himself, two intersecting lines that he had said represented the meeting of hard work and honest dealing as the only reliable coordinates for navigating a life. She thought about the eastern grazing sections and the water rights on the creek and the sound of 800 cattle moving through the sage in the early morning light, a sound like slow, continuous thunder, a sound that was her inheritance in ways that had nothing to do with gold certificates or land deeds. She was not going to let Emmett Vance sell those grazing sections to the Denver and Pacific Railroad. She was not going to let him sell anything. She was going to live through this night, and she was going to find a way back to Cheyenne, and she was going to stand in front of every person who needed to hear it and tell them exactly what Emmett Vance had done in the name of acquisition and greed while his wife froze to death in an engineered catastrophe in the middle of the Wyoming winter. She was not going to die here, she said it aloud, under the quilts in the dark with the wind howling against the canvas and the temperature at 30 below, and her body moving in slow, inexorable stages toward a shutdown she could feel approaching the way you feel a storm approaching, through a change in pressure rather than visible evidence. She was not going to die here. She said it again. She kept saying it. She bit her cheek when the darkness got too heavy. She pressed her father's watch against her sternum and felt the tick of it like a second heartbeat. She breathed into the quilts and she talked to the dark and she refused, with every remaining calorie of warmth in her body, to close her eyes. She thought about the body she had lived in her entire life, the body the world had mocked and pitied and found excessive and inconvenient, the body that Emmett Vance had looked at with manufactured admiration for 5 months and genuine contempt for 11 more. That body right now in this tilted frozen wagon in the worst blizzard in 20 years was doing something remarkable. It was holding heat that a smaller body would have lost hours ago. Every pound that the world had spent decades telling her was a flaw was in this moment a form of armor. She understood this not as comfort but as fact. The plain biological fact that mass retained warmth, and that warmth was the only currency that purchased another minute, and then another, and then another. She had been given a body built for surviving exactly this. She had simply not known it until now. What she could not fight was the slow, incremental weight of the cold itself. The way it did not attack but simply accumulated, degree by degree, hour by hour, settling into her tissues with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. She was still talking when her voice stopped working. She was still thinking when her thoughts began to come loose from their moorings and drift in directions she could not track. She was still gripping her father's watch when her fingers went numb, and she could no longer tell whether she was holding it or had dropped it into the quilts somewhere beyond finding. The last coherent thing she registered was the silence. At some point deep in the violent heart of the night, the wind stopped. Not gradually, not tapering off the way storms sometimes did, but suddenly, completely, as though someone had closed a door on the other side of the world. The blizzard simply ended. The absence of sound was so total it had its own texture, its own weight pressing against her ears. And in that silence, somewhere in the frozen and failing machinery of her consciousness, Clara Reed made a final, furious, comprehensive decision. She was going to open her eyes in the morning, whatever it took, whatever it cost. Whatever the cold had taken from her by then, she was going to open her eyes. She closed them and held on. The dogs found her first. Seth Harding was 2 miles from his cabin when Kodiak and Juneau went rigid on their traces, ears flat, noses driving hard into the wind from the west. He had owned both dogs for 4 years, had trapped and hunted alongside them through 3 Wyoming winters, and he knew the difference between the alert they gave for elk and the alert they gave for something that troubled them in a deeper, less definable way. This was the second kind. Kodiak, the larger of the two, a silver and black Alaskan Malamute with a chest like a barrel, pulled so hard against the harness that the wooden sled behind him skidded sideways in the packed snow. Juneau followed without hesitation. Seth let them lead. He had come out to check his trap lines the morning after the storm, as he always did after a heavy blow, because the great die-up winter of 1886 was producing cold that snapped steel traps at the spring if you left them set too long, and a lost trap was a lost investment he could not afford. The storm had ended sometime in the dark hours before dawn, dropping its curtain of violence with the same abruptness with which it had raised it, and left behind a landscape so thoroughly transformed that the familiar contours of the valley below his cabin had taken on the quality of a dream, white and still and utterly silent, the kind of silence that rings in the ears like a tone pitched just below hearing. He crested the ridge above the valley floor and saw it. From a distance it looked like a natural mound, a drift sculpted by the wind into a shape that was almost regular, almost symmetrical. But there was a line in it that did not belong to wind-made geometry, a long curving arc that emerged from the snow at an angle no drift produced on its own. He knew that arc. He had seen it on every settler's wagon that had come through this territory in the past 15 years, the rib of a Conestoga. He came down the ridge on his snowshoes at a controlled run, the sled skidding behind him, the dogs lunging ahead with a focused, urgent energy that told him whatever was under that snow was not yet beyond caring about. He pulled his Winchester from his shoulder as a matter of habit and caution, because abandoned wagons in open country could mean many things, and not all of them were situations a man wanted to approach with his hands empty. The wagon had drifted over almost completely. Only the upper curve of 3 wooden ribs showed above the snow line, and the canvas cover had torn partially free on the windward side and wrapped itself around the frame in a frozen, rigid embrace. The rear axle was snapped clean, the back end of the wagon sunk deep into what was now a solidly frozen snowdrift, the fractured wood of the brake dark against the white around it. Seth crouched and looked at that brake. The fracture pattern was wrong for a cold snap failure. The wood had not shattered under stress the way iron-cold timber did when the temperature dropped too fast. It had given way from a specific point of weakness, a compromise in the grain that radiated outward rather than across. Someone had prepared this axle to fail. He filed that observation away and started digging. Seth worked with his hands and the short-handled spade he carried on the sled. The snow was packed hard from the wind and the cold, and it resisted him with a density that made the work slow and exhausting. He dug at the canvas flap, working his way around the frozen folds, pulling and prying until the ice gave way in sections that fell to the ground with a sound like breaking crockery. When he finally got the canvas back, the air that rolled out of the wagon's interior carried the cold of enclosed spaces where warmth has been, but is no longer present, a specific emptiness that Seth recognized from years of finding things the winter had taken. He almost called out. He stopped himself because he did not know what he was dealing with yet, and a man who announced himself before he understood his situation was a man who surrendered the only advantage that uncertainty provided. What he saw stopped the call in his throat entirely. She was buried under a mountain of quilts. He could see only the top of her head, dark hair frosted white with the ice that had formed from her own breath condensing and freezing in the enclosed space, and one hand, large and pale as marble, curled around something he could not immediately identify. The hand was the color of things that were past saving. He had seen that color before, on men who had frozen to death on the open range, and he felt a cold move through his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He pulled off his heavy leather glove and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. He held them there for a long time, long enough that Kodiak pressed his muzzle against Seth's leg and whined softly in the back of his throat. There, beneath his fingertips, so faint it was less a pulse than the memory of one, the ghost of a heartbeat, irregular and weak and barely distinguishable from his own imagination. Seth Harding had not prayed in 3 years. He had stopped the night Tobias died, stopped with a finality that felt less like a decision and more like a door swinging shut on its own, the latch dropping into place without anyone's hand on it. He had not argued with God or cursed at him or demanded explanations. He had simply stopped speaking into that particular silence because the silence had answered him once in a language he did not have the capacity to accept, and he was not willing to open that conversation again. He prayed now, 2 words barely formed, barely audible. Then he started working. Getting her out of the wagon was the most physically demanding thing Seth Harding had done since the winter he had spent 2 days digging his cabin out from under a snowslide that had buried it to the roofline. She was a large woman, heavy and completely limp, and dead weight in a confined space with a compromised floor and no purchase for his feet was a problem that required improvisation rather than brute force. He went back to the sled for the coil of rope he kept there. He worked the rope under her shoulders with hands that moved fast despite the cold, because he had spent 15 years learning to work precisely in temperatures that made precision difficult, and whatever skills he had built in that time, he needed every one of them now. He rigged a system of loops and pulls that allowed him to use the weight of his own body moving backward as the primary force. It took him the better part of 20 minutes to get her clear of the wagon, and every minute of it was a minute he was acutely aware of the cold and of the faint thread of pulse he had felt under his fingers, and of how thin that thread was. He got her onto the sled. He wrapped her in his own bearskin coat on top of the quilts she was already buried in. He strapped her down with the careful, deliberate thoroughness of a man who understood that the 2 miles back to his cabin were going to be the hardest 2 miles he had ever covered, and that arriving at the end of them with his cargo still alive was the only outcome that was acceptable. He looked at his dogs. Home, he said. Kodiak and Juno dug in and pulled. Seth pushed from behind, his snowshoes finding purchase in the packed snow, his muscles burning from the first 100 yards. The sled was heavy, far heavier than any load he normally ran, and the trail back to the cabin climbed in 3 places, the second climb long and steep enough that Seth had to lean into the back of the sled with his full weight to keep it moving forward. He did not stop. He thought about stopping in the way a man thinks about things that are simply not available to him, registered the possibility and set it aside, and kept moving. 2 hours and 11 minutes after he found her, he came through the door of his cabin. The fire in the hearth had burned down to coals in his absence. He rebuilt it fast, working with a practiced efficiency that had nothing graceful about it, splitting kindling over his knee when the pile on the floor ran short, feeding the fire in stages because he knew that what he needed was a sustained, controllable heat rather than the immediate blast of a fire built too large, too fast. He knew enough about hypothermia to know that warming a person who had been this cold too quickly could stop their heart as surely as the cold itself. The body in that condition was a system that needed to be coaxed back from the edge rather than dragged, and dragging could kill as readily as the original injury. He lifted her from the sled to the cot against the wall with a care that surprised him. Not because he was unaware of being careful, but because the care felt specific rather than general, directed at this particular person rather than at the abstract category of human being in distress. He did not examine that feeling. He set it aside and focused on the work. He removed her outer layers with the businesslike efficiency of a man who had cared for injured animals in conditions far worse than this, working around her size with the same practical neutrality he would have applied to any element of a difficult task. He wrapped her hands in cloth soaked in water he heated to tepid over the fire, not hot, just enough to begin the conversation between cold tissue and warmth without shocking the system into shutdown. He did the same for her feet, which were waxy and white and cold in a way that went beyond temperature into something cellular, the kind that left marks. He pulled his rocking chair close to the cot and sat down. For 2 days and 2 nights, Seth Harding did not leave his cabin for longer than it took to feed the dogs and collect snow for melting into water. He kept the fire at a consistent temperature, with an attention he had not given to anything in 3 years. He spooned warm beef broth into her mouth whenever her lips parted, which they did with a subconscious regularity that told him some part of her was still oriented toward survival, still reaching for what it needed, still refusing to stop. He wiped the fever sweat from her forehead when her body entered its second phase, and the temperature swung the other direction, the violence of the thaw expressing itself as a fever that made men delirious and dangerous. And he talked. He had not talked, really talked, in 3 years. He had spoken to his dogs. He had exchanged the minimum necessary words with the occasional trapper or supply runner who passed through the territory. He had gone to the trading post in Elk Creek twice since Martha died, maybe 3 times, and had conducted those transactions in as few syllables as the merchant would accept. The silence of the cabin had become a kind of companion to him over those 3 years, something he had grown accustomed to the way you grow accustomed to a permanent ache, not comfortable exactly, but familiar, known, no longer requiring explanation or apology. Now, with a woman dying in his cot and the fire crackling and the snow outside absorbing all other sound, he opened the silence up and filled it. He told her about Martha first. He told her the way Martha laughed, which was with her whole body, a full physical commitment to whatever was funny that had always made Seth feel that joy, genuine joy, was one of the most athletic things a human being could do. He told her about the way Martha had decided, in the spring of '83, that she was going to learn to play the fiddle, and had practiced every evening for 2 months with an enthusiasm that bore no relationship to talent whatsoever, and how the ranch dogs had howled along in what Seth had chosen to interpret as accompaniment rather than protest. He told her about Tobias. He had not said his son's name aloud since the funeral. He found that it did not break him the way he had expected it to, saying the name into the warm air of the cabin. It hurt with the specific clean pain of something real, the way a healed bone hurts when the weather changes, a hurt that carries information rather than just sensation. Tobias had been 4 years old when the diphtheria came through. 4 years old and already possessed of a personality so distinct and particular that Seth had sometimes looked at his son and felt a specific wondering bafflement at the mystery of how a person arrived in the world already fully themselves. Tobias had been afraid of horses and unafraid of everything else. He had carried rocks in both pockets at all times. He had called his father Seth because the T was difficult for him and he had not been on Earth long enough to correct it. Seth told the unconscious woman all of this. He told her about the week of the illness, which he had spent 3 years not telling anyone about, not even in his own interior monologue, because it was the week that had closed the door on prayer and on the version of himself that had existed before it. He told her about sitting at Tobias's bedside the way he was sitting at her bedside now, watching the fever take what it wanted from a person too small to have accumulated the reserves to fight it. He told her about Martha going 4 days later, quietly in her sleep, as though she had decided that a world without Tobias in it was one she could not find sufficient reason to remain in. He was not telling her these things for her benefit. He understood that. She could not hear him. Whatever reached her through the layers of unconsciousness and fever was not the content of words, but perhaps something more fundamental, the frequency of a human voice in a cold and silent place, the simple animal information that she was not alone. He was telling her for himself. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fire was burning low and Seth was half asleep in the rocking chair, his chin on his chest, when he heard a sound that brought him fully awake in the span of a single heartbeat. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath, the sound a person makes when they surface from very deep water. Her eyes were open. They were unfocused, moving in small, uncertain arcs across the ceiling of the cabin the way eyes move when the brain behind them is working hard to reassemble the relationship between visual information and meaning. Seth sat very still and watched this process with the careful attention of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds would tell him a great deal. She tried to move. Her body refused her, or rather complied only partially, producing a full-body shudder that ran from her shoulders to her feet and left her rigid and gasping. She looked at the ceiling, she looked at the wall, she looked at the fire. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, the breathing of a person whose nervous system was conducting a comprehensive systems check and not yet satisfied with the results. Then she looked at Seth. The change in her expression was immediate and total. The unfocused confusion collapsed into something sharp and specific and frightened, and she made a sound in her throat that was the preliminary architecture of a scream. "Easy now," Seth said. He kept his voice low and level, the same tone he used with animals that had been caught in traps, the tone that communicated the absence of threat before any words did. "Easy. You're safe. You're in my cabin. I found you in the wagon after the storm." She stared at him with dark eyes that were large with fear and bright with the residue of fever. He could see her trying to locate herself in time and space, trying to fit the information her senses were providing into a framework that made coherent sense, and he could see the moment when the memories came back, because the fear in her expression changed quality, deepened from the animal fear of an unknown immediate threat into something older and more complex and harder to soothe. He poured water from the tin pitcher on the table into a cup and crossed to the cot, moving slowly and without any sudden gesture. He sat on the edge of the chair beside her and held the cup where she could see it clearly. "Can you drink?" he asked. Her eyes moved from the cup to his face, measuring both. After a moment that held more weight than its duration suggested, she gave a single, very small nod. He supported her head with one hand, the back of his fingers against her hair, and tipped the cup slowly. She drank in small, careful swallows, and he watched the effort that even this required and said nothing about it. When she finished, he set the cup down. He waited. "Where?" she started. Her voice was barely functional, a dry, abraded sound that came from a throat that had been through something significant. She stopped and tried again. "Where are we?" "My cabin," Seth said. "About 2 miles north of where I found you, up in the pines on the valley ridge. My name is Seth Harding. I'm a trapper. I've been working this territory for about 8 years." She was quiet for a moment. "How long?" she said. 3 days. Something moved through her expression that he could not fully read. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, something had changed in them. Some acute crisis of the first moments had passed, and what remained was a woman taking careful stock of a situation she had not yet fully mapped. "My name is Clara Reed," she said. "Mrs. Reed," he said. "Miss Reed," she said, and then stopped, and something flickered across her face. "Clara," she said finally, as though settling a question she had been arguing with herself. "Just Clara." "Clara," Seth said, "you've got frostnip on your toes and your fingers. Not frostbite, you keep the toes. But you're going to feel it for a while. The rest of you is intact, though you lost some time getting here, and your body has been working hard to sort itself out. You need to stay warm and stay still for a few more days and let it finish the work." She looked at him steadily. He held the look without deflecting it, because he had found in his years of solitary living that the instinct to deflect direct scrutiny was a social habit and not a necessary one, and he had shed most of his social habits, along with everything else, 3 years ago. "You don't know me," she said. "No," Seth agreed. "You came out the morning after that storm and you brought a stranger back on your sled and you've been sitting here for 3 days. "I have. Why?" Seth considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you had a pulse," he said, "and I had a sled." She looked at him for another long moment. Then, very slowly, something in the rigid set of her jaw released, just slightly, just enough. She turned her face toward the fire and was quiet, and Seth returned to his rocking chair, and the two of them remained like that for a long time, listening to the fire and the wind and the sound of the dog settling in the lean-to, while outside the Wyoming winter continued its indifferent work. Over the following weeks, the cabin that had held nothing but Seth's grief and the sound of wind against log walls became something else. The change was gradual, and neither of them named it, because naming a thing prematurely is one of the ways people ruin things, and both of them had sufficient experience with ruin to approach it with considerable care. Clara healed with a stubbornness that Seth found himself watching with a respect he had not anticipated. She pushed against her physical limits with a systematic persistence that reminded him of the way water finds a path, not aggressive exactly, but completely implacable, always moving, never conceding the possibility of stopping. On the 6th day, she insisted on sitting up for meals rather than eating lying down. On the 9th day, she was on her feet, moving slowly around the small perimeter of the cabin with the deliberate, careful steps of someone relearning the negotiation between intention and body. On the 14th day, she asked Seth to show her how to rebuild a fire from coals. He showed her. He showed her other things too, because the practical reality of their situation was that Clara Reed was going to need to be fully capable of keeping herself alive if she was ever going to be able to do anything about the man who had tried to prevent it. He taught her the geography of the valley, the landmarks that oriented you when the snow made everything identical, the way the ridgeline ran, and where the creek ran under the ice, and which direction led eventually, in about 40 miles, to the nearest road south. He taught her to read the clouds for incoming weather with the specific vocabulary of a man who had learned the language of Wyoming's sky through 15 years of it having direct consequences for his continued existence. He taught her to shoot. The Colt Peacemaker was heavy in her hands the first time, heavier than she had expected, and the recoil from the first shot sent her stumbling backward a half step. Seth steadied her from behind with a hand at each shoulder, firm and brief, and she found her balance and raised the weapon again and fired. Her second shot was better. Her fourth was better still. "You're fighting it," Seth told her. "Don't fight the weight. Let your arm be part of it. The gun and your arm are the same instrument." She adjusted her grip. She fired again. The tin can he had set on a fence post at 20 yards jumped into the air and landed in the snow with a small, decisive thud. She lowered the gun. She looked at the snow where the can had been. She did not say anything, but Seth saw something happen in her expression, something quiet and complete, a settling, the recognition of a capability she'd not known she possessed, and that nobody had ever thought to offer her before. On a cold evening in late January, 3 weeks into her stay, she told him everything. She had been working up to it for days. He could see that now, in the way she had of approaching difficult things obliquely at first, circling them, testing the ground, before committing to direct engagement. He had noticed this pattern without remarking on it because he understood it. It was the approach of a person who had learned that vulnerability was a resource with limited reserves, to be deployed carefully and never wasted on ground that would not hold it. She told him about her father. She told him about the courtship, and how she had wanted so badly to believe in it that she had overridden the warnings her own instincts had provided at every stage. She told him what she had overheard in the barn, and what she had found in Emmett's study, and what she had watched Doyle do to the axle on the second afternoon of the journey. She told him about the night in the wagon, the cold and the darkness, and the hours of fighting what her body was trying to do. She told him all of this in a steady, even voice that only broke once, briefly, when she described what Doyle had said to her in the moment before the two men rode away into the blizzard. She covered her face with her large hands, not weeping exactly but close to it, the particular proximity to tears of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally found a place that might be safe enough to set it down. Seth set down the piece of pine he had been whittling. He had learned over the years that silence at the right moment was more useful than words, that the compulsion to fill a painful pause was a social reflex rather than a genuine offering of comfort. He waited. After a moment, she lowered her hands and looked at him. "Emmett has the lockbox," she said, "and the gold certificates. By the time I can get back to Cheyenne, he'll have used Judge Brandt to push through the death certificate, and then he'll sell the ranch." She paused. "My father built that ranch. He built it from nothing. It was the only thing he was ever proud of, and it was the only thing he ever left me, and I let a man who saw me as a transaction walk into my life and take it because I was foolish enough to want to be wanted." "You weren't foolish," Seth said. "You were a person who wanted what every person wants. That's not foolishness. That's just being human." She looked at him with the slightly wary expression she used when she was not sure whether a kindness was genuine or performed. He had noticed this expression in the first days of her recovery and had recognized it immediately, because it was the expression of someone who had received enough false kindness to have learned to test it before accepting it. "He left me to freeze," she said, "in a wagon, in a blizzard, because he wanted my father's land and couldn't find another way to take it." "I know," Seth said, "and nobody in the world knows I'm alive." "I know," Seth said again, "and that is going to change." She looked at him. Outside, the January wind pushed against the cabin walls with a persistence that had over the weeks become a familiar background sound, almost comfortable in its constancy. The fire crackled. Juneau lifted her head from the floor and then set it back down. "I'm not asking you to help me," Clara said carefully. "I'm not in a position to ask anything of anyone." "You didn't ask," Seth said. "I'm telling you." The weeks that followed built themselves around the rhythm of two people who had each lost everything and were learning, carefully and without rushing it, what it meant to no longer be entirely alone. They worked alongside each other with the practical efficiency that shared survival requires, and in the gaps between work they talked, and in the gaps between talking they were quiet in a way that did not require filling. Seth noticed things about Clara Reed that he had not expected. He noticed that she was funny, in a dry, understated way that ambushed you when you weren't prepared for it. He noticed that she was genuinely curious about things, not as a social performance but as a fundamental orientation toward the world, the kind of curiosity that made her ask precise questions and actually listen to the answers. He noticed that she was braver than most men he had known, not in the showy, declarative way that men sometimes performed bravery, but in the quiet, daily, ongoing way that required no audience and received no applause. Clara noticed things about Seth, too. She noticed that he moved through the world with a deliberateness that was not slowness, but rather the efficiency of someone who had learned to make each action count, because he could not afford to waste anything, including motion. She noticed that he was gentle in ways that did not announce themselves, the way he handled injured animals, the way he spoke to his dogs, the way he had sat beside her cot for 2 days and talked into the silence not because it would help her but because the silence had been eating him alive and she had given him a reason to break it. She noticed that he looked at her as though she were simply herself, Clara Reed, a person with a history and a set of capabilities and a particular way of moving through the world, and that this was so unfamiliar to her as to feel, at first, almost suspicious. She tested it the way she tested everything. It held. On a gray afternoon near the end of March, a trapper named Aldous Briggs came through the valley with a mule and a sled loaded with beaver pelts he was running to the trading post in Elk Creek. He had been in Cheyenne the previous month, he said, settling a property dispute with a cousin, and had spent 2 weeks in town waiting for the roads to clear enough for the return journey. Seth gave him coffee and dried elk meat and let him warm himself by the fire before sending him on his way. It was Clara who asked the question, casually, in the tone of someone making idle conversation while she stirred the pot on the fire. "Any news from Cheyenne worth mentioning?" Aldous Briggs scratched his jaw and thought about it with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who encountered conversation infrequently enough to savor it. He mentioned the cattle losses from the die-up, which were catastrophic across the whole territory. He mentioned that 2 banks had called in loans and broken 3 ranching families in the process. He mentioned, as a secondary item of relatively minor interest, the way a person mentions something moderately interesting that has no direct bearing on their own affairs, that a widower named Vance had been having quite a run of luck despite the die-up on account of the inheritance he had come into after his wife's tragic death in the December storms. "Probate hearing set for the first week of May," Aldous said, accepting a second cup of coffee with evident satisfaction. "Judge Brandt signed off on the death certificate back in January. Understand there's a railroad company from Denver sniffing around the land. Big money moving through that county courthouse these days." He left 20 minutes later, his mule picking its way through the crusted snow toward Elk Creek, and Seth watched him go from the doorway and then turned back to the cabin. Clara was standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and her face perfectly still, and Seth recognized that stillness because he had seen it before, in the weeks since she had been well enough to be fully herself, and he understood that it was not the stillness of a person who was calm, but the stillness of a person who was thinking with a focus and intensity that had temporarily suspended everything else. "First week of May," she said. 5 weeks, Seth said. "The Denver and Pacific Railroad," she said. "If they acquire the land title through probate, the sale could be executed inside of 30 days. Diamond Cross would be gone before summer." She paused, and something moved through her expression that was not quite anger and was not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. "My father refused to sell to those people. They came to him twice. He showed them the door both times. He said a man who sold his land to a railroad was selling the only thing in his life that would outlast him." She looked at the fire. Emmett knew that. He knew it, and it didn't matter to him at all. Seth crossed the room and stood beside her and looked at the fire alongside her. "The roads through the pass will be clear by mid-April," he said. 4 days' ride to Cheyenne from here in reasonable conditions. Clara turned to look at him. There was something in her expression that had not been there in January, something that had been built or rebuilt over the weeks of recovery and work and cold mornings spent with a Colt peacemaker in her hand, learning to trust her own aim. It was not anger, though anger was part of it. It was something more fundamental, the expression of a person who has decided, at a level below conscious deliberation, that the only available response to what has been done to them is forward motion, not revenge exactly. Something older and more sustainable than revenge. Reclamation. "I need to be in Cheyenne before that hearing," she said. "I know," said Seth. "I need you to come with me," she said, "as a witness, not as a protector." She met his eyes directly and held them. "I need someone who can testify to the condition I was in when you found me. What the wagon looked like, what the break in that axle looked like, because you saw it and you know it wasn't a cold weather failure. I can fight my own battle. I just need someone who can speak to what I survived and how I survived it." Seth looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, a single clean inclination of his head. "We leave the second week of April," he said. "Give the passes time to clear." He moved toward the door to check on the dogs, then stopped with his hand on the latch. He turned back. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. "Emmett Vance left you in that snow because he thought your size made you less," Seth said. "Before we go down there, I need you to hear this. The same body that he mocked and diminished is the same body that survived 30 below zero for 8 hours in an open wagon in the worst blizzard this territory has seen in 20 years. I found you alive because of what you are, not in spite of it. Don't walk into that town carrying 1 inch of the shame he tried to put on you. Not 1 inch of it." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. The fire popped softly behind her. Outside, the late March wind moved through the pines with a sound that was almost but not quite the sound of something beginning. She nodded once, slowly, like a door opening inward. 3 days later, on the first morning of April, Seth came in from checking on the horses and found Clara standing at the small square of mirror glass he kept nailed to the wall above the wash basin. She was not looking at herself the way she usually moved through the world, quickly and without dwelling, as though sustained attention to her own reflection was something to be avoided rather than sought. She was looking with a directness and a duration that was entirely different. He stopped in the doorway. She did not hear him, or if she did not acknowledge it, and he understood instinctively that the moment did not belong to him, and that his only role in it was to not disturb it. She raised one hand slowly and looked at it. Those fingers that had gone waxy and white in the cold, that he had wrapped in tepid cloths and watched come back to color over 2 days of careful tending. The hand that had gripped her father's watch through 8 hours of a Wyoming blizzard and had not let go. She turned it over, palm up, and looked at the lines of it in the morning light coming through the small window beside the basin. Then she lowered it and straightened up and became aware of him in the doorway, and whatever had been in her face settled back into its usual composure. But he had seen it. He had seen the moment of recognition, the particular quality of a person meeting themselves, honestly, and finding perhaps for the first time that the meeting was not something to be avoided. "We should start preparing the horses," she said. "We should," Seth agreed. He was almost to the door of the lean-to when she spoke again quietly, in a tone that was almost private, as though she was finishing a thought she had been working through for some time. "I'm going to need a red dress," she said. "Something they can see from across the room." Seth paused with his hand on the doorframe. He did not turn around because he understood that the moment did not require his face, only his presence and his acknowledgement. "Elk Creek Trading Post carries dry goods," he said. "We can stop on the way through." "Good," said Clara, and that was all. But the air in the cabin held the quality of a thing decided, a course set, a direction chosen with the kind of finality that does not invite revision. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. The dogs shifted in the lean-to. Outside, the first real warmth of an early April sun was beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to release the grip of the longest winter Seth Harding had ever lived through. They saw Doyle Vance before he saw them. Clara spotted him first. They were coming down off the eastern slope of the pass above Elk Creek, the horses picking their careful way along the snow-crusted trail, when she caught movement on the road below, a single rider moving at a canter through the last of the afternoon light, heading north. She pulled her horse up without a word, and Seth came alongside her and looked where she was looking and went still. The rider was big, heavy-set, sitting a horse the way a man sits when riding his transportation rather than anything else, hunched forward with his weight dropped into the stirrups. He wore a long brown canvas coat that Clara recognized before she recognized anything else about him, because she had watched that coat disappear into a blizzard on the night of December the 4th, and the sight of it now, in the thin April sunlight of a Wyoming spring that had barely started, produced something in her chest that was not fear but was adjacent to it. Doyle Vance. Heading north, heading toward the valley where Seth's cabin sat in the lodgepole pines above the frozen creek. "He's going back to check," Seth said quietly. "I know," Clara said. They sat on the ridge and watched him move through the valley below, and Clara understood with complete clarity what this meant. Emmett had sent his brother back to confirm what the blizzard was supposed to have accomplished months ago. Either Emmett had grown nervous as the probate hearing approached, or someone in Elk Creek had mentioned something in passing, a trapper who had seen a lamp burning in a cabin that was supposed to be empty. A casual word that had traveled the way words traveled in small frontier settlements, and Emmett, who was careful enough to have planned everything else with such thoroughness, was careful enough to want to verify his foundations before he built the final structure on top of them. If Doyle reached the cabin and found it recently occupied by more than one person, he would know. If he came back to Cheyenne and told Emmett what he found, Emmett would have time to move money, alter plans, and disappear entirely into the vast western territories with $60,000 in gold certificates and a head start that Clara could not overcome. She looked at the road below. She watched the rhythm of Doyle's ride, unhurried, the pace of a man who expects to find a dead woman and has allocated an afternoon to the confirmation of it. She thought about everything that had led to this moment, every choice that had been made, and every choice that had been made for her without her knowledge or consent. And she understood that this was not a complication. This was an opportunity. She looked at Seth. "I need you to loop around the north ridge and come up behind him on the Elk Creek Road," she said. "I'll come down the slope directly and cut him off on the trail." Seth looked at her steadily. "Clara, he doesn't know I'm alive," she said. "That's the only advantage I have right now, and I need to use it before it's gone. If he sees me before he has any room to run, he'll stop. Shock alone will hold him long enough. And if it doesn't..." Clara pulled back her coat to show the Colt Peacemaker holstered at her hip, worn smooth from weeks of handling and practice. "Then I equalize the room," she said, "the way you taught me." Seth studied her face for a moment with the attention he had developed over 4 months of watching her think. And then he turned his horse toward the north ridge without further argument, because he had learned enough about Clara Reed to know that when she had decided something at this level of certainty, further argument was not caution but obstruction. Clara waited until he was into the trees and the sound of his horse had faded into the pines. Then she started down the slope. She came down through a stand of scrub pine and out onto the road approximately a quarter-mile ahead of where Doyle was riding. She brought her horse to a stop in the center of the trail and sat there and waited with her hands loose at her sides and her heart beating with a steadiness that she had not expected, because she had expected fear, and what she felt instead was something much cleaner and much colder and much more useful. She was ready. She had been ready, she realized, since the morning she had opened her eyes in Seth's cabin and understood that the only way through was forward. Doyle came around a bend in the trail at a canter and pulled up so hard his horse reared, front hooves leaving the frozen ground, the animal shrieking with the abruptness of it. Doyle fought the horse down with rough, automatic hands, the hands of a man who rode often and without tenderness, and then sat very still in the saddle and stared at the woman blocking the road. The color left his face as though someone had opened a drain somewhere below his collar. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Hello, Doyle," Clara said. He stared at her with the expression of a man whose understanding of the basic mechanics of the physical world has just been subjected to a fundamental revision. She watched him work through the stages of it, the disbelief, the search for an alternative explanation that would leave the world as he had understood it intact, the beginning of the cold recalculation that lived behind his eyes when his instincts finally overcame his resistance and told him that what he was seeing was real. His hand moved toward his coat. "I wouldn't," Seth said. Doyle spun in the saddle. Seth had come out of the tree line on the north side of the road behind him, his horse standing broadside across the trail, the Winchester resting across his saddle horn with a casualness that was more threatening than any overt display would have been. The barrel was pointed at a spot approximately 6 inches to Doyle's left, close enough to be a promise and far enough to be a question about how the next several seconds were going to go. Doyle's hand returned to his saddle horn. He looked at Clara. He looked at Seth. He looked at Clara again, and she saw in his expression the specific arithmetic of a man assessing the distance between where he was and where he needed to be and arriving at the conclusion that the distance was not coverable by any means currently available to him. "You're supposed to be dead," Doyle said. His voice was lower than she remembered, rougher, stripped of the contemptuous ease it had carried on the night he had made his remark about her natural insulation while her husband strapped her inheritance to his saddle and rode away into a blizzard. "I'm aware of what I'm supposed to be," Clara said. "Get off the horse." He did not move immediately. She could see him working through his remaining options, cataloging them and rejecting them one by one with a speed that told her he was not a stupid man, whatever else he was. The calculation took approximately 8 seconds. Then he swung down from the saddle with the deliberate, measured movements of a man who understood that sudden gestures in the current situation were inadvisable. Seth was off his horse before Doyle's boots hit the frozen ground, the Winchester in one hand and the rope coil from his saddle in the other. He bound Doyle's wrists behind his back with the economical efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years securing things that did not want to be secured, and Doyle submitted to it with a sullen, rigid stillness that was less cooperation than the simple absence of a better option. Clara looked down at him from her horse. Doyle Vance, who had crouched in the snow beside a wagon axle in the late afternoon of a December day and done what he had been told and paid to do, and who had ridden away laughing. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically smaller, he was still a large man, heavy-set and broad through the shoulders. But smaller in the way that things which have terrified you appear smaller once the terror is gone, reduced to their actual dimensions without the distortion that fear adds to everything it touches. "Here is what you need to understand," Clara said. Her voice was calm and even and carried no tremor. "You are going to ride with us to Cheyenne. You are going to ride quietly and without incident, and you are going to arrive in Cheyenne in a condition to speak clearly to Sheriff Walt Greer. Because Sheriff Greer is going to ask you questions, and your answers to those questions are going to determine whether you spend the next 10 years in Laramie Prison or whether you spend the rest of your life at the end of a rope." She paused for exactly the right amount of time. "The difference between those two outcomes depends entirely on how cooperative you choose to be between here and Cheyenne." Doyle stared at her. "Do you understand me?" Clara said. A long moment stretched between them. Then Doyle Vance, who had mocked her in a blizzard 4 months ago and ridden away certain he would never see her again, dropped his gaze to the road and gave a single, slow nod. They rode through Elk Creek the following morning. Clara went into the dry goods store while Seth kept watch on Doyle outside. The woman behind the counter was small and gray-haired and businesslike in the way of people who operate trading posts in small frontier settlements, efficient and unsurprised by almost anything. She pulled bolts of fabric from the shelves without comment when Clara described what she needed, measuring with practiced efficiency, cutting clean lines with heavy shears. The dress would need to be finished on the road, which Clara had already accounted for. She bought needle and thread, a second pair of wool socks, a jar of coffee, and 3 days' worth of provisions, and she paid with the coins she had sewn into the hem of her winter coat on the night she had packed for the journey that was supposed to kill her. She sewed in the evenings beside the fire when they made camp. Her stitches were not beautiful. Her mother had tried to teach her needlework in childhood, and Clara had found the patience required for it largely incompatible with her temperament. But the stitches were strong, which was the quality that mattered, and by the second evening the dress was taking a shape that was recognizable as intentional rather than approximate. Doyle was quiet during the ride. Not the quiet of a man at peace, but the quiet of a man running the arithmetic of consequences and not finding the results to his liking. He ate what they gave him and slept where they told him to sleep and studied the horizon with the expression of a man measuring distances he could no longer reach. On the second night, after Seth had secured his wrist to a pine root and banked the fire and settled the horses, Doyle spoke. "He's not going to fold easy," he said. He was looking at the fire, not at Clara. "Emmett, you think you can walk in there and it all falls apart, but you don't know how deep he's dug himself in Cheyenne since January. Judge Brandt, the bank, there are people in that town with reasons of their own to want you to stay dead." Clara was threading her needle in the firelight. She did not look up from her work. "I know about Judge Brandt," she said. "I know about Harrison Coyle at the bank. I know about the witnesses Emmett has arranged." She pulled the thread through the fabric with a steady hand. "I know considerably more than your brother thinks I know. He made the mistake of underestimating me once. I'm counting on him to make it again." Doyle was quiet for a moment. "The men he's got will swear they saw you walk away from that wagon voluntarily," he said. "He's had 4 months to build his story and paper it over." "I know," Clara said. "So what do you have?" Clara looked up from her sewing then, across the fire at Doyle Vance. She held his gaze for a moment without answering, giving him time to understand that the answer was going to matter. "I have you," she said. "And I have a key." She set the needle into the fabric and reached up to the collar of her coat and drew out the thin leather cord she wore around her neck. On the end of it hung a small iron key, worn smooth with months of contact against her skin. She held it up in the firelight so that the glow caught the metal, and she watched Doyle's eyes go to it and then go still. He recognized it. She could see that he did. "He took the lockbox," she said. "He did not know I had the only key. My father gave it to me the morning before he died. It has been around my neck every day since." She held it there for a moment longer, then tucked it back under her collar and picked up her sewing. When Sheriff Greer asks Emmett to open that lockbox in front of witnesses, and Emmett cannot produce a key, I will produce one, and what is inside that box has my father's name on every certificate, not Emmett Vance's. Doyle said nothing else that night. They rode into Cheyenne on a Thursday morning in the first week of May, coming in on the northern road through a morning that was cold and clear and bright, the kind of spring morning the Wyoming Territory occasionally produced, as though in reluctant acknowledgement that the winter could not last forever. The streets were busy with the commerce of a territorial capital emerging from a hard season, wagons and horses and men in working clothes moving between storefronts and offices with the purposeful energy of people who had been largely confined for months and were compensating for it. Nobody looked twice at them. A woman and two men riding in on a Thursday morning was not an event in a town this size. Clara had worried, somewhere in the back of her planning mind, that she would be recognized before she was ready, that the word would travel ahead of her and Emmett would know and have time to adapt. But Cheyenne was a territorial capital, not a small settlement, and its streets did not catalog faces with the attentiveness of a rural community. She was a large woman in a good coat on a horse. She was unremarkable. She let herself be unremarkable for a little while longer. She found Sheriff Walt Greer at his office on 16th Street, a square brick building with bars on the windows and a handwritten sign on the door that read Laramie Skankety Sheriff with one of the words misspelled and never corrected. She had remembered Greer as a tall man, and he was well over 6 feet, with a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor life into a permanent quality of dry, careful attention. He was at his desk with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers when Clara walked through the door. He looked up. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds with the expression of a man whose eyes are reporting something that his brain has not yet formally authorized. Then he stood up from his desk so fast the coffee cup tipped and had to be grabbed with both hands. "Clara Reed," he said. It was not a question. "Clara Reed," she confirmed, alive and considerably irritated about the inconvenience. Walt Greer came around his desk and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent decades cultivating professional composure and is currently finding it insufficient to the moment. He had known Arthur Reed for 20 years. He had stood at the man's grave and meant every word he said there. He looked at Arthur Reed's daughter standing in his office in the first week of May, when she had been officially dead and buried in county paperwork since January, and he took a long, slow breath through his nose. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything. She had organized it during the 4 days of riding, arranging it into a sequence that was clear and chronological and specific, because she understood that the difference between a credible account and an emotional one was structure, and she needed Greer to hear a credible account. She told him about the barn, and the letter, and the axle, and the night in the wagon. She told him about Seth finding her, and the months in the cabin. She told him about Aldous Briggs and the probate hearing and the Denver and Pacific Railroad. She told him about Doyle, who was currently secured to a hitching post outside under Seth's supervision. Greer listened to all of it, without interrupting once, which Clara recognized as the mark of a man who understood that the time to ask questions was after the account was complete rather than while it was being assembled. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his large hands flat on the desk in front of him. "Emmett Vance has been in Cheyenne since January," Greer said. "Set himself up at the Cattleman's Hotel. He's been in my office twice, once to report his wife lost in the December storm, and once to follow up on the status of the death certificate. Both times he presented himself as a grieving widower." Greer paused. "I didn't like him either time. Something in the presentation was too polished. Men who are genuinely grieving don't present as cleanly as that." "Did you investigate?" Clara asked. "I looked into it," Greer said carefully. "But a woman lost in the worst blizzard in 20 years, with a broken wagon axle and no witnesses to anything contrary, is not something a sheriff can build a case on from instinct alone." He met her eyes. "I received a letter in February, claimed to be from you, said you were well and staying with a cousin in Nebraska, and that there had been a misunderstanding about your death. The letter wasn't written the way you talk. I didn't believe it, but I couldn't prove it wasn't yours." Clara felt the shape of this settle into place. Emmett had covered that angle too, had written in her name to preemptively close any inquiry before it could gain momentum. She felt something that was not quite admiration but occupied the same territory, the cold, impersonal recognition of an opponent who was genuinely skilled at what he did, entirely separate from the fact that what he did had been designed to erase her. "He has 2 witnesses," Greer said, "men named Purvis and Galt. They'll testify they saw you leave the wagon on your own during the storm. He has Judge Brandt's signature on the death certificate. And he has a document he's been carrying that he claims is a power of attorney you signed before the journey, transferring management of the Diamond Cross assets to him in the event of your incapacitation." "It's forged," Clara said. "I believe you," Greer said. "The question is proving it publicly, because Emmett Vance is not going to walk out of that bank voluntarily, and Judge Brandt has enough of his own reputation invested in that death certificate to resist quiet correction. This needs to happen in front of witnesses, or it gets buried in process for months, and in that time the land transaction gets done. The signing is this morning, Clara said. What time? Greer looked at the clock on his wall. 10 o'clock, he said. First National Bank. 40 minutes. Clara stood up. Then we don't have time for paperwork, she said. We have time for one thing. What's that? Greer said. Clara reached into the collar of her coat and drew out the leather cord and held up the iron key so that the morning light from the window caught it. Greer looked at the key. Then he looked at her. Something moved in his expression, the professional composure settling into something harder and more purposeful underneath it. The expression of a man who has just understood what he is looking at and what it means. Get your deputies, Clara said. Bring Doyle Vance. And if you have a moment to spare, I would be grateful for the use of a room where I can change my dress. She had sewn it by firelight over 4 evenings on the road from Seth's cabin, and it was not a work of any particular elegance. The hem was uneven on the left side, and one of the seams at the waist pulled slightly when she moved. But the color was exactly what she had asked the woman in Elk Creek for, a deep saturated crimson that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, the color of something fully alive and entirely deliberate and completely unwilling to be overlooked. She stood in the small back room of the sheriff's office and put it on. She did not look in the mirror above the wash basin. She did not need to. She looked instead at her hands, the hands that had gone waxy and white in a wagon in December, that had been wrapped in tepid cloths and coaxed back to warmth and color over 2 days in a stranger's cabin, that had learned to hold a Colt peacemaker and fire it straight, and that had sewn this dress in the dark by a campfire while a prisoner slept on the far side of the flames. She turned them over, palms up, in the thin morning light. These were the hands of a woman who had survived what was supposed to kill her. These were the hands of Arthur Reed's daughter. She thought about her father. About what he had told her once, sitting on the porch of Diamond Cross in the evening with the cattle moving through the sage in the distance, his voice carrying the weight of something learned through the full cost of experience rather than inherited through advice. You are not what people say you are, he had told her. You are what you do when saying isn't enough. She put on her hat, the wide-brimmed one from the Elk Creek trading post, and pinned it with the hawk feather Seth had found on the valley floor 2 mornings before they left and pressed into her hand without explanation, the way he offered most things that mattered. She walked out of the back room. Seth was waiting in the front office. He looked at her and something shifted in the set of his face, a change so slight that most people would not have registered it. But Clara had spent 4 months in close quarters with this man, and she had learned to read the small register of him. He said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Walt Greer had his hat on and his 2 deputies organized. Doyle Vance stood between the deputies with his wrists bound and his face set in the expression of a man who has finished his calculations and arrived at the conclusion that his only remaining currency is cooperation and that he had better spend it carefully. They walked to the First National Bank of Cheyenne. The bank occupied a corner building on Capitol Avenue, limestone facade and brass fittings, the kind of building designed to communicate that the money held within it was taken very seriously by very serious people. Clara had been inside twice before. Once with her father when she was young, and he was showing her the shape of what he had built, and once alone after his death, beginning the process of understanding what she had inherited. She knew the layout. She knew that Harrison Coyle's office sat at the back of the building behind the teller cages, and she knew that the transaction Emmett was completing today would take place at Coyle's desk rather than in the public lobby, because Coyle was precisely the kind of man who preferred to conduct his more complex arrangements away from casual observation. She pushed through the double doors. The lobby of the First National Bank of Cheyenne was occupied on a Thursday morning, tellers behind their cages working through the week's business, customers at the writing desks, 2 men she did not know sitting near the window. The ceiling was high, the floors marble, the kind of acoustic environment where sound traveled with an unexpected clarity, where a voice pitched to carry would carry a considerable distance. She walked through the lobby toward the back office. She did not hurry. She let her boots find the rhythm of the marble floor, the deliberate, unhurried percussion of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had allocated all the time she needed to get there. The door to Coyle's office was open. She could see them through the doorway before any of them saw her. Harrison Coyle behind his desk, a soft-looking man in an expensive suit with the carefully cultivated smile of someone who had learned early that appearing trustworthy was considerably more efficient than being trustworthy. A man she did not recognize sitting to one side, a lawyer by the look of his coat, with a leather portfolio open across his knee, and Emmett Vance, standing at the desk, leaning slightly forward, a fountain pen in his right hand, the nib hovering above a document spread across the mahogany surface. He was about to sign. I'd hold off on that, Clara said. Her voice rang out through the doorway and into the lobby behind her, with a clarity that she had not entirely planned but did not regret, because the people in the lobby turned at the sound of it, and their turning was the first element of the public witness she needed. The fountain pen stopped moving. Emmett Vance turned around slowly, with the controlled deliberateness of a man who is managing a very strong internal reaction and does not want to display it before he understands what he is dealing with. He turned and he saw her, and the color went out of his face with a completeness that would have been almost interesting to observe under any other circumstances. He said nothing. His mouth opened and then closed and then stopped entirely. "Hello, Emmett," Clara said. She walked through the doorway and stood in front of his desk with her hands at her sides and looked at her husband across the mahogany surface between them. "You look well. Better than you deserve under the circumstances." Harrison Coyle had risen from his chair. "Mrs. Vance," he started, and then stopped because the implications of the woman standing in front of him were already catching up with his reflexes. "I don't understand. The death certificate," Judge Brandt declared, "was obtained fraudulently," Clara said without shifting her eyes from Emmett. "She kept them on him the way you keep your eyes on something you have been tracking for a long time and do not intend to lose. By a man who drove his wife into the Wind River Valley in a blizzard, with a wagon axle his brother had deliberately compromised 2 days into the journey, abandoned her to freeze to death, took her entire inheritance, and then forged a power of attorney and bribed a county judge to declare her legally dead so he could liquidate her father's ranch and sell the land to a railroad company." The lobby behind her had gone entirely quiet. She was aware of it without turning to look, the way you are aware of a change in pressure without needing to see its source. Emmett found his voice. It came back thin and stripped of the easy manufactured warmth she remembered from the courtship, from the evenings on the porch of Diamond Cross when the autumn light went gold across the sage and she had believed, with all the fullness of her heart, that she had finally been genuinely chosen. "She's lying," he said. He pointed at her with the hand that still held the fountain pen, a shaking and reflexive gesture that told her more about his current state than anything he had yet said. "This woman is an imposter. My wife is dead. Judge Brandt confirmed it in January. Whatever scheme this is, it is designed to defraud me of my legally inherited—"
"Your legally inherited property,"
Clara said, and her voice was so calm it seemed to settle into the high-ceilinged room like something solid. "Yes, let's discuss the legal status of that property." She reached into the collar of her crimson dress and drew out the leather cord and held up the iron key so that everyone in the doorway and the lobby beyond could see it clearly in the morning light. "Emmett, where is my lockbox?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt much longer. Emmett stared at the key. The calculation behind his eyes was moving fast. She could see it moving, and it was arriving at conclusions he did not want. "The lockbox," Clara said again, her voice still steady, still carrying. "The iron lockbox that you removed from the wagon on the night of December the 4th and strapped to your saddle while I lay bundled in quilts trying not to freeze to death. The lockbox you brought to Cheyenne with you. The lockbox you have been representing as your own property since January." She held the key up in the light and let the silence hold it. "This is the only key that exists for that box. My father pressed it into my hand on the last morning of his life. It has been around my neck every day since. If that lockbox belongs to you, Emmett, then explain to these people what this key is doing around the neck of the woman you buried." She heard the sound move through the lobby behind her, the low, wordless expression of a crowd that has just watched the weight shift in a room. Emmett turned to Harrison Coyle. "Coyle, send for the law." "The law is already here," Walt Greer said. He stepped through the doorway behind Clara, his deputies at his shoulders, Doyle Vance between them with his hands bound and his eyes fixed on the floor. Emmett looked at his brother, and whatever strategy remained available to him in the next several seconds required Doyle's silence, and Doyle's presence here in the custody of the Laramie County Sheriff communicated, with complete clarity and no words necessary, that Doyle's silence was no longer something Emmett Vance could purchase or command. "Emmett Vance," Greer said, "step away from that desk." Emmett did not move immediately. He looked at Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the manufactured warmth of the courtship and not the cold contempt of the marriage, but something rawer than either. The expression of a man looking at the precise location where his plan came apart and understanding, for the first time and far too late, what he had actually been dealing with all along. "You should have stayed in that snow," he said. His voice had dropped to something barely audible. It was not a threat. It was almost in its stripped-down honesty and acknowledgement. "I know," Clara said. "That was your first mistake." Greer stepped forward. His deputies moved with him, and Emmett Vance, who had spent 5 months constructing an architecture of fraud on the foundation of one woman's presumed death, took a single step backward and then stood entirely still while the handcuffs went on. Harrison Coyle was already tearing up the transfer documents with the brisk, self-preserving efficiency of a man who understands that every second those papers remain intact is another second of his own implication in their contents. The lawyer with the portfolio had quietly closed it and was making his way toward the door with the unhurried urgency of someone who has correctly identified an exit and intends to use it. Greer's deputies led Emmett out through the lobby. The crowd parted for them and then closed again behind them, and the sound that rose from the assembled citizens of Cheyenne was not celebratory exactly. It was something more complex than that. The sound of a community adjusting its understanding of events it had been given a false account of, recalibrating itself against a reality that was both simpler and considerably uglier than the story it had been told. Doyle, still standing between the remaining deputy and the office doorway, spoke without being prompted. He spoke to Greer rather than to Clara, in the flat, factual tone of a man delivering information he has decided is the only currency he has left and that he had better spend it now, before the market for it closes. "I tamped the axle housing on the second day out," he said. "Eastern side of the Laramie Mountains at the creek crossing where we stopped to water the horses. Used a hardwood wedge driven into the joint from underneath. Emmett calculated the placement so it would hold until the temperature dropped far enough to make the wood brittle and the wedge would shift. He picked the location in the Wind River Valley specifically because it was far enough from any settlement that nobody was likely to come across the wagon before spring thaw." The deputy wrote this down in a small notebook without looking up. "The power of attorney is forged," Doyle continued. "Emmett had it produced by a man in Denver. Same man produced the letter Greer received in February that was supposed to be from her." A pause in which Doyle seemed to be conducting some final internal accounting. "The witnesses, Purvis and Galt, he paid them $200 each in January. They have never been within 50 miles of the Wind River Valley. They couldn't describe that wagon or that location if their lives depended on the description." Greer nodded once and told his deputy to take Doyle to the jail. Then he turned to Clara. "That will hold them," he said. "I'll have Judge Brandt's certification reviewed by the territorial court by the end of the week. His involvement is going to require its own investigation, which I expect will be uncomfortable for him." He paused. "The Denver and Pacific representative is at the Cattleman's Hotel. I'll have someone inform him this morning that the property he came to Cheyenne to acquire is no longer available for acquisition, and that he should plan his return journey accordingly." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara said. Greer looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized from her father's funeral, a man paying a debt of respect he considered genuinely owed rather than socially obligated. "Your father," he said, "was one of the finest men I knew in 40 years of living in this territory. I am very glad to be telling you that in person rather than adding it to something carved in stone." He put his hat on. "Welcome back to Cheyenne, Miss Reed." He walked out through the lobby and the remaining crowd parted for him, and then slowly, in the way of people who have witnessed something they know they will be discussing for a long time and are already beginning to sort the telling of it, dispersed. Clara stood in Harrison Coyle's office and looked at the desk where Emmett had been standing with the fountain pen and the transfer documents, and she breathed. She breathed the way she had breathed in the wagon on the night of December the 4th, slowly and with full intention, taking measure of what she had and what she no longer had and what the difference between those two things now meant. Coyle remained behind his desk. He had the expression of a man preparing an apology carefully calibrated to forestall consequences, and Clara looked at him for a moment without offering the charity that expression was designed to produce. "The Reed accounts," she said. "All of them going back to January of this year. I want a complete accounting delivered to Diamond Cross Ranch within the month." "Of course," Coyle said. "Miss Reed, I want to assure you that the bank's involvement was entirely procedural, that we had no specific reason to doubt the legitimacy of the documentation presented to us. I will be retaining a lawyer to review every transaction conducted in my name or in Emmett Vance's name since January of this year," Clara said. "If that review identifies anything that requires further conversation between you and Sheriff Greer, I expect you to cooperate fully and promptly with that conversation." Coyle's mouth opened and then closed. "Fully," he said. Clara walked out of his office. Seth was waiting in the lobby. He had positioned himself where he could see through the office doorway and could reach her in 3 steps, if anything had required reaching, but far enough back that the entirety of the confrontation had been hers, completely and unmistakably hers, which was exactly where he had understood it needed to be, and exactly the kind of understanding she had come to rely on from him without ever having had to ask for it. She walked to him and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the lobby of the First National Bank of Cheyenne was not the place for what needed to be said. And because some things that are earned together over a long winter do not require immediate words to be fully understood between the people who earned them. "Well," Seth said finally. "Well," Clara agreed. They walked out through the double doors and onto Capitol Avenue, into a May morning that was clear and warm and smelled of mud and sage, and the particular freshness that comes to the Wyoming territory after a long winter releases its hold. The air with the quality of something returned rather than something new, familiar in its bones but clean in a way it had not been for a very long time. The street was alive with commerce and motion and the ordinary noise of a territorial capital going about its business, and Clara Reed stood on the boardwalk outside the First National Bank of Cheyenne in a crimson dress she had sewn by firelight and let the May sun fall on her face and breathed all of it in. She thought about Diamond Cross Ranch. About the eastern grazing sections where the grass came in thick and silver green in late May, and the creek that ran along the southern boundary with the sound of water that had traveled a long way to get there, and the hill where her father was buried with his view of the 3,000 acres he had made from a quarter section of broken ground, and a borrowed team of oxen, and the specific unyielding conviction that a man who did honest work on honest ground had nothing to apologize for to anyone. She thought about what waited for her there, The fences that would need attention after a winter with no one properly working the ranch. The cattle reduced from the 800 her father had left, some lost to the die-up, some decisions she would need to make and make quickly before the summer grazing season was underway. The paperwork and the legal process and the 100 practical necessities of reasserting ownership over a life that had been declared legally finished. She was not afraid of any of it. She had been afraid of many things in her life, afraid of being alone and afraid of never being chosen and afraid of taking up too much space in a world that kept telling her she already did. She was not afraid of work. Work was the one thing the world had never been able to take from her, and it was the one thing that had always given back exactly what she put into it, which was all her father had ever promised the territory would do, and all she had ever needed it to promise. She reached out and took Seth's hand. He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and she saw in him the thing she had first seen on that morning in early April when she had stood at his mirror, and he had watched from the doorway without announcing himself, the expression of a man who has lived through the worst thing that can happen to a person, and has arrived unexpectedly and without entirely planning for it, on the far side of it at something worth staying for. That 1,000-yard distance she had first seen in his eyes on the morning she woke in his cabin was gone. What had replaced it was something quieter and warmer and entirely without performance. "Come back to Diamond Cross with me," she said. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was an offering made from a position of genuine strength, the way her father had told her all genuine offerings should be made, freely and without reservation, and with the full understanding that the person receiving it was capable of making their own choice. Seth looked out at the Wyoming horizon, the blue distance of the mountains, the enormous open sky that arched over the whole territory with the comprehensive indifference of something that had been there long before any of them and would be there long after, and that offered no promises of ease but also enforced no limits on what a determined person might accomplish within it. "I'll need to go back for the dogs," he said. "Obviously," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved, and the traps on the north ridge. "Good traps, not the kind of thing you leave behind." "We'll get the traps," Clara said. He turned to look at her fully then, and what was in his face was the same thing that had been there in the cabin on the evening she had told him everything, and he had set down his whittling and waited, in the right kind of silence, for her to finish. It was the face of a man who had learned through loss to hold things gently rather than with the desperate grip of someone afraid of losing them, but who was holding this particular thing right now, with a care and a steadiness that had nothing desperate in it at all. "All right," Seth Harding said. They stood together on the boardwalk in the May sun with the sounds of Cheyenne moving around them in all directions, and Clara Reed, who had been thrown away by a man who believed the Wyoming winter would do what he was too calculated to do himself, held onto the hand of the man who had pulled her out of the snow and looked south down the road that led back to Diamond Cross Ranch. Her father's land, her land. The ride home would take 2 days through country that was beginning, slowly and stubbornly and with the particular reluctance of the Wyoming high plains, to turn green again. There was work waiting at the end of it, the kind of work that asked everything of the person doing it and gave back exactly what was put in. No more and no less, which was the only bargain the territory had ever offered and the only bargain Clara Reed had ever needed. She was ready for all of it. She had known since the morning she opened her eyes in a stranger's cabin and made the decision to stay alive long enough to find out what she was made of, that this moment would come. She had carried that knowledge through the cold and the pain and the long months of careful preparation and the hard days on the road with a prisoner and the 40 minutes in a bank lobby that had required every ounce of everything she had built in herself over 26 years of being told she was too much. She knew now what she was made of. She was made of the same material as the land she was riding back to, something that could be buried under 3 feet of snow and still be there in the spring, intact, waiting, ready to grow again the moment the conditions allowed it. Her father had known that about her long before she knew it herself. He had built it into her deliberately, year by year, with the quiet patience of a man who understood that the most valuable thing he could leave his daughter was not land or gold certificates or even a good name, but the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. She understood that now. She understood it the way she understood the weight of the Colt at her hip and the taste of Wyoming spring air and the warmth of a hand that held hers without needing to be asked and without needing to be thanked. A warmth that had nothing manufactured in it and nothing that would fade when the novelty wore off. The warmth of something real. Clara Reed turned her horse south and rode toward home.